Colorado's Democratic-controlled General Assembly poised to send several gun control bills to Governor Jared Polis roughly 2 months into the legislative session. The Center Square contributor Derek Drapen reports the House is expected to hear on third reading this week Senate Bill 26046, which would require all purchases of gun barrels to be made in person at a firearm dealer. Now, last week, House lawmakers approved legislation to expand that state's red flag law and require strict permitting requirements and security measures at gun stores. Another bill that would ban using 3D printers to make firearms or components and criminalize possession of digital instructions is scheduled for a second reading on the Senate floor Tuesday. I've already seen questions about how you can go about the First Amendment protections of blueprints for 3D printer schematics. We'll see how that plays out in Colorado. Democrats there arguing the bills are aimed at reducing gun violence. Republicans arguing that it chips away at Second Amendment rights to keep and bear arms that the Second Amendment says shall not be infringed. Meanwhile, the bill would also require firearm dealers to keep sale records of barrels for at least 5 years, and that bill was scheduled for third reading Monday. In other news, at thecentersquare.com, you can find by getting it in your inbox. Go to thecentersquare.com and sign up for that newsletter daily. You'll get those headlines. Meanwhile, a group of Washington sheriffs urging Governor Bob Ferguson to veto sections of Senate Bill 5974, and they're still waiting to find out if their concerns will be addressed when the bill is signed into law. The Center Square Associate Editor Carlene Johnson reporting the highly contentious bill would require county sheriffs and police chiefs to meet new eligibility requirements, which include having at least 5 years of full-time law enforcement experience and not having done or said anything that would get state certification revoked by the Criminal Justice Training Commission in Washington. That commission could revoke certification for misconduct, leading to elected sheriffs being removed from office. Mason County Sheriff Ryan Sperling said his constituents still asking a lot of questions about the bill.
I hear politicians say things that aren't necessarily true all the time, yet they're not necessarily held accountable, but sheriffs are in a different category according to a lot of people. So that's one of those things that they're wrestling through. Should sheriffs be political? Should we be able to say, or should it be controlled? And this bill effectively will mute sheriffs because of the threat of being decertified and removed. If my constituents are pushing me to stand up against something that Olympia is doing, I'm going to speak out, or depending on the level or the degree, we're going to say something, and this is going to potentially stifle that and again control the First Amendment rights.
The letter Washington sheriffs sent to the governor, signed by Sheriff Sperling of Mason County, Sheriff Clay Myers of Kittis County, Sheriff Mark Sider of Walla Walla County, and Sheriff Brad Mankey of Stevens County. Federal law enforcement officers, they've joined Transportation Security Administration workers at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago. The Center Square's Jim Talamonte reports ICE agents were seen at O'Hare and several other airports around the country. More than 400 TSA employees have left the department, and thousands of others are missing work, while a lapse in federal funding leaves them without paychecks. American Federation of Government Employees Local 777 told the Center Square that TSA workers are concerned. They said at the end of the day, they've been loyal to aviation and protecting the flying public, and all they're requesting is to be paid, not to be replaced. When they see individuals assisting them, the union said it gives union members the thoughts that they're trying to get replaced instead of trying to keep them on board. The union said their members would have another issue in April when rent and mortgage payments are due for a second month, since they were last paid February 13th. President Donald Trump was asked Monday if he would consider giving $10,000 bonuses to TSA workers who do show up on the job, even during a partial government shutdown, as he did last year. He said it could happen. He also went on to blame Democrats for the lapse in funding for TSA workers. Still no resolution there on whether or not you're going to see a bill pass Congress to fund DHS. Meanwhile, the federal government is the one who should control hikes in gas prices, according to Democratic attorneys general from across the country who blame the Trump administration and the U.S.-Israeli conflict with Iran on surging gas prices. The Center Square regional editor Dave Mason reports Attorneys General Rob Bonta of California and Kwame Raoul of Illinois made the comments late Monday morning when the Center Square asked them what their states could do to limit the jump in prices. They said that it is the Trump administration who initiated the conflict with Iran. Attorney General Kwame Raoul called the conflict, which he noted was started without congressional approval, another federal action that makes life less affordable. Californians, who consistently experience the nation's highest gas prices for several years, even outside of international conflicts, saw an average of $5.79 at the pump Monday. According to AAA, Illinois' average price for a gallon of gas, $4.17. For both states, that's an increase over $1 a gallon since 1 month ago. Both prices are above the national average of $3.96 a gallon, which is an increase of slightly less than $1 a month. Illinois and California also having the state's highest gas taxes. The White House telling the Center Square that stressed gas hikes are temporary. The president has said temporary pain for long-term gain. Tuesday, they also heard a case around at what point an individual attempting to enter the United States can claim asylum protections. Joining us to discuss this is the Center Square Apprentice reporter, Andrew Rice. Andrew, thanks for taking time with us. It's a deep issue impacting a fair amount of people in the country, and there's also a lot of politics involved here. Give us an overview of what this case means and what justices heard today in court.
Right. Well, thanks for having me, Greg. This case is a hugely consequential one, as you said. Asylum is a big issue going on, and how it is processed in the United States is a big issue that's going on. Just getting out of the arguments earlier, just getting out of reporting on those arguments, there was clearly a partisan and political divide. A lot of justices, some of the justices appointed, more liberal justices, clearly were wanting to side with this immigration advocacy organization that was arguing that if you are on the Mexico side of the U.S.-Mexico border, you should be entitled asylum protections. Really, it got all to the heart of this 1990 Immigration and Nationality Act that says once you arrive in the United States, you are entitled to asylum protections, and you're entitled to a hearing with an immigration judge and going through that official process. And some of the liberal justices clearly agreed with that, or appeared to agree with that in the arguments today. But there was definitely some pushback from the other side of the aisle, and a lot of justices were looking to define at what point does arrives mean. At one point, even Justice Gorsuch said, if I'm halfway across the Rio Grande, does that mean I've arrived in the United States? That was a really salient point that really showed how are we defining this term from a statute from decades ago, really. And it will have a dramatic impact on how we look at asylum law and truly just the definition of arrival in the United States moving forward.
Yeah, and what exactly is asylum, and what words can people be told to use with border officials to be able to get asylum status? There's obviously a lot of nuance here, Andrew, but you were outside the courts when some demonstrators were on the steps sharing their perspective. Nicole Ramos, director of border rights at the Border Rights Project, she argued for it to be a humanitarian issue, one that takes a look at just exactly who is looking to get asylum and who would be cut off if the Supreme Court sides with those who want stricter asylum guidelines. Here's that clip.
We cannot be a people that says never again if we enforce policies that make death inevitable. We cannot be a country that espouses family values and to protect children when we let them die on our doorstep. We cannot be a country that professes to be one of laws and human rights if we allow a president and administrative policy to dictate who is desirable and who will be allowed in to grant access to the only legal process that can save their lives. Asylum is not a loophole. It is not a trick. It is the only legal process available for refugees to save their lives.
Again, an advocate on the steps of the Supreme Court just before the justices started hearing arguments, seeming to take a bit of a humanitarian approach to this. But you also had others who were sharing somewhat of a spiritual perspective. Here's Abi Janamanchi with the United Universalists Association. He's a reverend, and he shared his thoughts on how this idea is not just a one religion idea. Here's what he had to say.
People of faith and faithful people across traditions, Hindus, Christians, Jews, Muslims, and the occasional Unitarian Universalist as well. People who just know better, standing together. The brief that we all signed says what our traditions have always taught. Safeguarding and protecting the stranger is not an optional thing. It is at the heart of everything that calls us to practice radical hospitality, not just for individuals, but for whole societies.
Andrew, these are two perspectives. Were these brought to the court this morning? Were these things that they argued, or did we get more into kind of the nuance and the legalities of this question?
Right. That's a great question, Greg. Truly, in the arguments, there was not much talk about this this idea of hospitality and needing to speak to a sense of faith and speaking to a sense of a desired goal based in religious tradition. Really, the justices and the lawyers representing both sides of this issue were focused on the legality of the issue. They were focused on what does it mean when someone is said to arrive in the United States? What does that definitional language mean? And the justices were really focused on that. There was not hardly a single appeal to the more emotional and humanitarian aspects that we saw in some of those clips. Really, it was a large focus on what does this definitionally mean? How did the statutes that have stated you are entitled to asylum protections when you arrive in the United States, how does that apply to the modern day when people are coming up to that US-Mexico border or any other port of entry in the country?
It's fascinating, again, to kind of see, on the streets, you hear about the humanitarian issues, you kind of have the tugging of the heartstrings, so to speak. But when it gets down to the nitty-gritty detail, it's about the legalese and how to interpret these laws. And in courts, a lot of the times, Andrew, I'm sure as you're seeing as reporting on the U.S. Supreme Court, they don't really, give lane to that emotional side of things. They seem to just stay in the lane of this is about the law, this is about our interpretation of the law, and we can't let emotion get involved in that. Andrew, what's next with this case, but also the case that we talked about to open the show with that you also reported on yesterday concerning election law? Give us kind of a timeline. When can we actually see some outcome of their opinions in these cases?
Yes, absolutely. Well, these are two very substantial cases, and it is kind of a surprise that the court is hearing them at this point in the term because the Supreme Court's term will wrap up at the end of June. Typically, they try to have all their opinions and decisions out by the very end of June so they can recess for July and August. However, there have been some exceptions in recent years when you have very substantial cases that reach into the very beginning of July. But the justices will have to make a decision on this case in the next few days, really. This case and the election law case that you mentioned earlier, these cases in the next few days, and start writing briefs and start applying the existing law and new law and have those decisions out by June. And I even heard this in the case today. Some justices really wanted that clarity on the arrival, on what that arrival means, because they know that lawsuits are going to come after they issue a decision in June at the end of their term.
Something else about the courts, it seems like some of these cases don't actually end at the Supreme Court. Sometimes it just opens avenue for other lawsuits in the lower courts, and we may actually see this or similar questions brought up in the future. But as we await a decision in those cases and plenty of others, Andrew, it seems that we do have a decision on a case that impacted the center square directly when it comes to requests for open meetings information. Tell us about this case.
Right. Yes, exactly, Greg. This case affected in a big way affected the Center Square. The Center Square has been litigating this case over the past several years over and allowing public and press access to meetings of the Tennessee Judicial Advisory Commission. They apply practices and procedures. They give recommendations to the Tennessee Supreme Court. And so we filed this lawsuit because back in 2018, the commission they sought to stop these meetings from being public due to a disruption, and so the Center Square filed a lawsuit, and ultimately the meetings have remained closed throughout litigation, throughout years of litigation. However, once the Center Square applied petition up to the Supreme Court seeking a relief in this case, seeking to open up these meetings to the public that were, according to court documents and the record, open for 35 years prior to their closure in 2018. We petitioned to the Supreme Court, but were unfortunately denied on Monday. We're denied, and that's going to be something that we're looking for kind of a closure to
some kind of resolution, right? Yeah, it's one of those things where as reporters we have to use public records laws sometimes to get information, and sometimes there are roadblocks, and when there are roadblocks, take it to court to see what the legalities really boil down to. Well, Andrew, greatly appreciate your reporting. We'll definitely keep an eye on what's going on at the U.S. Supreme Court and you and the team with the Center Square. After the murder of a Loyola University student in Chicago, allegedly by a migrant who was in the country illegally, the debate around migrant sanctuary cities and policies continues. Sheridan Gorman, 18 years old of Yorktown Heights, New York, was murdered in Chicago last Thursday. A Venezuelan national was charged. Now, during the swearing in of Oklahoma U.S. Senator Markwayne Mullin as the new Department of Homeland Security Secretary Tuesday, President Donald Trump explained the tragedy.
On Thursday, a precious 18-year-old college student named Sheridan Gorman was shot and killed while she was walking in a park. She was just walking into the park, didn't do anything. The illegal alien monster charged with Sheridan's brutal murder had come illegally from Venezuela and been released into our country by sleepy Joe Biden. But he was then arrested and released again by Democrat governor, a real slob of a governor, J.B. Pritzker, in the sanctuary city of Chicago, which we could make safe in 2 months, I would say. 2 months if we sent in the group.
Now, Chicago is a migrant sanctuary city with a so-called welcoming ordinance and other policies in city and county and state government prohibiting local law enforcement, including jailers, from cooperating with federal immigration officials. Now, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, the president just referenced, he told reporters at the state capitol in Springfield, Illinois, Tuesday that Trump's administration is partly to blame.
Well, this has been a terrible tragedy, and I know that the Gorman family has suffered mightily. I agree, there have been real failures. Those failures, of course, extend beyond the borders of Illinois. That's their national failures, a failure to have comprehensive immigration reform, a failure of the president to follow his own edict to go after the worst of the worst.
Have you tried to speak with Sheridan's parents? If so, what did they say? If not, why not?
Well, first of all, I wanted to give them time to grieve, but I have reached out to local officials who have talked to them to express my condolences, my wife's condolences as well. We'll, at the appropriate time, certainly speak directly with them.
Now, Illinois Republicans said Pritzker is showing his true colors. Illinois House Minority Leader Tony McCombie said no one believes that Trump is to blame for Biden's open border that let this criminal in, or for Pritzker's failed sanctuary state and soft on crime policies that attract illegal immigrants here to Illinois. Stop passing the blame, McCombie said. It is within your authority to fix the problem, Governor. She says that various policies from Illinois' Trust Act and other migrant sanctuary policies make things worse. Other Republicans from Illinois at the state capitol Tuesday also reacting from both the House and Senate.
Governor Pritzker is the first one to go to other communities to talk about the tragedies that supposedly take place there when he wants to point his finger at our law enforcement community. But where's the outrage in Illinois? Once again, another person senselessly murdered on the streets of Illinois.
Have you had enough yet? Have you had enough of the deadly consequences of Governor Pritzker's failed policies? And now the chaos inside the city hall is spilling into the open. The mayor's deputy mayor for public safety was fired and now is sounding the alarm on what we all knew all along. Brandon Johnson's administration is openly anti-police.
These incidents are not just isolated to Chicago. Former Virginia Attorney General Jason Mires joined a family of Stephanie Minter at the Virginia State Capitol Tuesday, calling for policy changes following her killing in Fairfax County. The Center Square's Shirlene Guerrero reports Minter was fatally stabbed at a bus stop. Police have identified the suspect, who's been charged with second-degree murder in the case, and they say the suspect was in the United States illegally and had more than 30 prior arrests. The Department of Homeland Security also said immigration authorities had previously lodged a detainer order against him. Minter's mother, Cheryl, called for changes to prevent similar cases. She said changes have to happen. It's just got to. In Philadelphia, the Center Square regional editor Kristen Smith reports residents there expressed both support and opposition for migrant sanctuary policies during a recent Pittsburgh City Council meeting.
My name is Mark McKean. I live in the 9th Ward. I believe in the rule of law. I don't believe in council, who is the legislative branch of the city, making laws that people should ignore. And council should not do that either as it pertains to federal immigration law. There's a difference between illegal immigration and legal immigration. What I see that you council people are doing is a quasi sanctuary city legislation. And I'm not for that. And most Americans are not. So you can sit there and drink your lattes and embrace your San Francisco buddies, but that shouldn't happen here in Pittsburgh, because most of us believe in the rule of law.
I'm Holly Hickling. I'm from East Carnegie. I wasn't planning on speaking today, but I've suddenly felt a little bit inspired. I wanted to thank the council people who are bringing forward the immigrant protection legislation. Very excited about that. I'm the executive director of the Global Switchboard. We're a human rights organization, and
So from Chicago to Pittsburgh and now Phoenix, you have Arizona State Senator John Kavanaugh criticizing the city of Phoenix on its resolution restricting federal immigration enforcement. Kavanaugh told the Center Square contributor Zachary Schmidt that Phoenix's resolution limiting U.S. immigration and customs enforcement operations in the city is, quote, illegal and grandstanding virtue signaling. On Wednesday afternoon, the Phoenix City Council will vote on a resolution requiring federal law enforcement to obtain the city's approval before conducting law enforcement activity. That meeting is set for 2:30 Mountain Time and will live stream at phoenix.gov. That resolution says that law enforcement not to cooperate with and help federal immigration authorities. Let's turn to the Center Square's Esther Wickham for a story about how much one particular California school is spending, not necessarily on students, but on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Esther, thanks for taking time with us. As always, how much are taxpayers paying for DEI at just one California school?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So Defending Education just came out with these documents, contracts between Merced City School District and various DEI initiatives and programs, and discovered that there's over $900,000 that the school district has paid out to these consultants on DEI initiatives and programs for students around the school district. And we're seeing here, the contracts include African American affinity groups for 100 African American students and a summer rap camp. And this, all facilitates over taxpayer dollars, $900,000. So we're getting close to $1 million here just for these DEI initiative programs.
Fascinating when you look at how that money's being used for consultants and so on. But, let's take a look at some of the other stats from this school district, Esther, that you were able to get out in your reporting. Just how many students are there? How many students to teachers are there? And then you look at the outcomes of their education. And, is this almost $1 million helping them get better outcomes?
Yeah, when you look at, how much how much the school is spending versus how the students are doing, the school district, has over 11,000 students, and the teacher ratio is 25 students to 1. And so that's not a ton. I'm sure the teachers are extremely exhausted, and in general the country is seeing a national teacher shortage, so that's something to be concerned about. But also, according to Niche, which is kind of a school ranking grade reporting website and organization, they looked at how this specific school district is doing, and we see that 20% of students in the school district are proficient in math and only 33% in reading. And their overall grade, because this reporting organization looks at the school districts versus on grades, and they get an overall C grade. Specifically, academics and teachers have a C grade, and I think diversity got a B, but their overall grade is a C. And so the taxpayers just have to wonder, how are these students excelling in academics? They're in the education system. That's the goal. But then we're over here seeing and uncovering these documents and contracts that their taxpayer dollars are going towards these diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, but their students aren't necessarily excelling in academics.
We're seeing a lot of concern about education and the tax dollars that are used to fund these schools. And in some areas across the country, it seems they're spending a lot on students with not really that great of outcomes, where some other areas are spending less and getting much better outcomes. Makes you wonder if the curriculum is to blame and who's deciding on that curriculum. And I guess one way you can look at that is how much money is being spent on something like DEI programs. Now, Esther, one of the things we were talking about before we jumped on here with the Center Square Daily was part of this program included a rap song. I don't know this group. Tell us a little bit about this song, the lyrics there were, and maybe what some of that tells you.
Yeah, so like I said before, part of the contract goes to this rap camp, and there's videos on YouTube. The company has the various videos facilitating their and marketing the thing that they are selling to these schools. But specifically, the signature program is titled "More Than a Month," and their song lyrics model after hip hop groups, just to kind of engage the students. Nowadays, students have very low attention spans, and so they're trying to mix hip hop and interesting entertainment and media with education. But as we see with some of the lyrics that I quote in the story, one of the lyrics says, "This track's for you, every teacher and parent. You need this truth. Our history books have a white male skew, but believe me, I ain't blaming you." And so it kind of has this angle, this perspective that everything that the teachers are teaching, whether it comes to American history or education, it's going to have a white male skew. And, this is a perspective. This is an opinion. If there is a more conservative family or teachers or students, they might not necessarily agree with that. And so it's interesting to see that, these artists are coming in and trying to educate their kids and kind of stating it as a fact, as truth, even though, this is a very controversial subject, and whether, diversity, equity, and inclusion has a good message or has a good purpose. Is it trying to, push a specific ideology onto the kids, or are they actually striving to educate the students? As I said before, Defending Education did this investigation, and talking to Erica Sanzi, who's the Senior Director of Communications, they're saying that, this spending of almost $1 million on these programs are based on identity and activism, and that's indefensible. And in this case, she says that these specific affinity groups should be illegal, right? Because they're not necessarily focused on educating kids, as she believes, are facts and truth, but just an ideology or an opinion and that kind of skew.
Well, and you got to think, sure, there can be groups, and there's the chess club, there's the, theater club, there's jazz band, and those are based off interests, not based off somebody's DNA or, color of their skin, right? And I think that's where a lot of the people who oppose these types of initiatives say, all of this seems to want to put people into a certain category just based off the color of their skin, not off the content of their character. And again, I think it's an ongoing conversation that, Esther, obviously the Trump administration has been very opposed to DEI programs. How does this work into that equation, especially with the threats of withholding federal tax dollars?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, literally like 5 days into President Trump's second term, he signed an executive order, wanting to remove and eradicate, as he says, diversity, equity, and inclusion, because from his perspective and the administration's perspective, they believe that these kinds of initiatives and these kinds of programs are discriminatory and are wasteful. And so he wants to focus on, merit-based practices. And so just like you said, you want to focus on the content of their character. And, are these students actually excelling in academics? Are they achieving what they want to achieve when it comes to their careers and future endeavors? And so I think when it comes to that argument, I think both sides of the coin believe that. They want to protect students. They want to, push students towards the best, success that they can do. But the way that they achieve that is a little bit different. When Merced City School District was able to comment on this, they didn't necessarily respond to the Center Square, but they have made statements in the past, and they said they are proud to support, this partnership and these groups coming to their school because they believe, quote, it's a unique approach to education, engaging students in music and media and much more to kind of accept and understand that diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Now, I know a lot of states, especially states that might have a Democrat lean to it, are looking at budgets and how their K through 12 systems are going to be impacted by the possible withholding of federal tax dollars if they include DEI type of programs in their education curriculum, even after school programs that get federal tax dollars. Some of that could possibly be scrutinized further. So this obviously is going to be an ongoing thing we'll watch, Esther, and it's good we've got you for the Center Square to keep an eye on that. One other story that deals with DEI in particular, and you can find this headline at the Center Square, National Medical School Accreditor dropping remaining DEI requirements. How do you think that fits into this ongoing conversation of the Trump administration's insistence that education strip DEI out of its curriculum?
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, we're going to start to see around the country people either complying or rejecting, and we're just going to continue to see the lawsuits pile up. And specifically with this medical school, again, we have the two differing perspectives with that threat of withholding federal funding. The Trump administration has used that strategy time and time again. Some universities and some school districts have bent for that fear of losing federal funding, and some have stood their ground. But in this case with a medical school, they did follow through for fear of accreditation standards. And, what we're seeing on both sides is one is saying, yes, we shouldn't prioritize ideological training. We should be looking at, clinical preparation. Are these students prepared to enter the workforce, not based on what they look like, but how they act? What are they actually doing in the classroom and in the work environment? And, are they using critical thinking and professional development? And that's, that perspective of we want our students to excel, but we don't want it based on, their skin color or their gender. And then we have on the flip side, those opposed to this decision for lowering or removing the DEI initiatives. We have the Economic Policy Institute saying that without protected and equitable pathways for students of color, we risk returning to higher education systems defined by exclusion rather than opportunity. And so, again, both perspectives have that goal of wanting students to excel, wanting them to be successful in the workforce and within education and actually learning. But we see that kind of conclusion, are we actually going to eradicate diversity? And, students of color, are they going to have those opportunities if we remove DEI? Or, on the other side, if we take away diversity, equity, inclusion, we can actually focus on the student itself, him or herself, and are we actually seeing them excel for the things they're doing, not just the way that they look or their background. And so it's definitely going to be an ongoing conversation, and we're going to see probably a lot of issues pop up here and there depending on the state and the school district. But it's interesting to continue to watch how much school districts are actually paying and how that's impacting the taxpayer as a whole.
And again, especially as these school districts have the local taxpayers, and they also get money from the state and the federal government, and how all this plays into the bottom line. Clearly, during an election year, I think DEI is going to continue to be one of those hot button issues. All right, the price of diesel fuel reaching an all-time high in Washington state today, $6.55 a gallon, according to AAA. That means a driver filling up a 200-gallon tank for a big rig using diesel is paying more than $1,300. That price spike being blamed in part on the conflict involving Iran and also refinery disruptions, tightening the supply of gasoline. But the Center Square reporter, Carlene Johnson, says states like Washington face even higher prices due to stricter environmental regulations and higher state gas taxes. Now, the trucking industry and school districts across the state of Washington feeling the pain at the pump. Jeff Bosma, owner of Fastway Freight in Spokane, told the Center Square Thursday that most of the increase will indeed trickle down to the consumer.
We're only 15 miles from the Idaho border from where we're at here. So any of our trucks that go, we have many trucks daily that go into Idaho. So we've just had those trucks make sure they always, once they start coming back, that they fuel up before they come back to Washington. And a typical truck is probably, a lot of trucks are about 200 gallons. Some are, less than that. But let's just say you have a smaller tanks because like our trucks go out and back every day. 100 gallons, right? 70 cents. There's $70. I'm just going to say that truck fuels up, maybe not every day, but it's even 3 days a week, right? There's $210 a week.
So it's not just those who are moving goods. It's going to be impacted by those increased gas prices. It's also taxpayers who are funding local school districts, filling up their buses. Vicki Alonzo with Auburn School District Communications in Washington State telling the Center Square their district receives fuel 4 times per month, and one refueling drop increased by about $23,000. But another school district saying that they are seeing the rising costs. They operate a diverse fleet that includes buses powered by propane and electricity. But concerns of increased costs continue, especially during the heavy road trip season we're all getting ready to enter. In North Carolina, precedent-setting cases, the U.S. Supreme Court and the 4th District Court of Appeals guided a North Carolina judge to uphold that state's photo identification voter requirement this week. The Center Square managing editor Alan Wooten reports North Carolina voters approved voter identification at the polls in 2018 through a constitutional amendment on that November ballot. But in those midterms, 55.5% of nearly 3.7 million voters were in favor. The court this week saying that it must follow the law of the United States Supreme Court and the Fourth Circuit. And that left State Senator Phil Berger, the president pro tem for the North Carolina General Assembly's upper chamber, said, finally, after 7 years, we can put to rest any doubts that the state's voter ID law is unconstitutional. He went on to say this is a monumental win for the citizens of North Carolina and election integrity efforts. 24 states require voter ID. 12 others accept some kind of form of identification without a photograph. The California Senate unanimously passing a bill Thursday that renames Cesar Chavez Day Farm Workers Day. A few hours later, California Governor Gavin Newsom signing the bill, which received unanimous approval from the Assembly Monday. That March 31st state holiday was going to be known by its new name. It was, again, Cesar Chavez Day, and as the Center Square's Madeline Shannon reports, the legislature moved to rename the day, originally in favor of Chavez, after a New York Times investigation published this month found that there were multiple allegations of sexual abuse and assault by Chavez against women and girls for years. Chavez, who was president of United Farm Workers, died in 1993. The California legislature joining other governments across the country in removing Chavez's name from parks, schools, streets, and days honoring the U.S. farm worker movement. The Phoenix City Council Wednesday voted to rename Cesar Chavez Day Farm Workers Day, while the city of Seattle took Chavez's name off of one of its parks in the South Park neighborhood. And a bill that would require Illinois workers to be provided more protections from excessive temperatures made progress at the Illinois General Assembly this week. The Center Square reporter Sean Reed reports House Bill 3762, as amended, would require the Illinois Department of Labor to adopt extreme temperature safety standards for employers by the beginning of 2027, with enforcement beginning the following year. The bill would require employers, when conditions are hot, to provide water colder than 61 degrees, paid rest breaks with access to shade, either schedule modifications or task rotation to limit exposure and access to personal protective equipment. But what about when the temperatures are too cold? Well, the bill says employers must provide thermal protection and face coverings, mandatory warm-up breaks, and either schedule modifications or task rotation to limit exposure. A Republican state representative said the bill's scope was too large and emphasized that it could possibly impact things like professional sports teams. But the Workplace Extreme Temperature Safety Act recommended for adoption by the Illinois House Labor Committee. Upon agreement that it would be back with an amendment, they wrap up session May 31st. And that is America's Talking, with headlines from across the country. Sign up for the newsletter at thecentersquare.com. And also like, subscribe, and share The Center Square on all your social media channels. From my studios in Central Illinois, I'm Greg Bishop, and you could join us back here Monday for more stories impacting you, the taxpayer, from across the country, only with The Center Square Daily.